when he was speaking, and that was like an easy layup when he said, how hard can it be to criticize neo-Nazis?
Right.
It sort of puts you in the place where we are, where it's just surreal that Donald Trump has trouble even criticizing neo-Nazis and white supremacists. But you know what? We have a guy who wants to be on the United States Supreme Court, and we'll get to this later too, Brett Kavanaugh, who would not even answer whether it was right to stop people from coming into the United States because of their race. That's unheard of. But again, we'll get to that a little bit later on. But these are strange, strange times, and unfortunately, weak and sniveling men and women will do or say just about anything. Just looked at Capitol Hill to see that, to try to get in the good graces of a man who has absolutely no understanding about what America's constitutional norms are, or who we are, what values we have as a country.
Yeah, my daughter has stopped talking to me about politics quite some time ago because it was all too much and too negative. My phone lit up, both of them, during Obama's speech, and Snapchats, and you know what? It all started coming in because they were finally excited again. So that certainly says something. Former President Obama continued his foray back into the political scene this weekend, once again making the case against the man now holding his old job, President Trump. The former president was on the campaign trail in California on Saturday, working to rally voters as Democrats make plays for 7 competitive congressional districts there. Obama's speech was notably different from the one he delivered in Illinois on Friday, working to turn out the vote in November rather than directly attacking the Trump administration. Still, the former president took a number of veiled shots at his successor.
We're in a challenging moment. Because when you look at the arc of American history, there's always been a push and pull between those who want to go forward and those who want to look back, between those who want to divide and those who are seeking to bring people together, between those who promote a politics of hope and those who exploit politics of fear. I deeply believe is that there are no set of problems, there are no set of issues that we can't solve if we're working together and we're true to the traditions that are best in America. It's always tempting for politicians, for their own gain, and for people in power to try to see if they can divide people, scapegoat folks, turn them on each other, because when that happens, you get gridlock and government doesn't work, and people get cynical and they decide not to participate.
Mika, you talked about before how this is unusual for a former president to actually be campaigning against a current president's interest. Well, you, of course, have Donald Trump, who's broken every rule. You have Donald Trump, who is still campaigning against a woman he defeated 2 years ago, still having crowds chant, lock her up, lock her up. Donald Trump is making this a continuation of a campaign against Hillary Clinton and a constant campaign against Barack Obama. So if I were a Democrat and if I were somebody that wanted to win this fall, I would hope that Barack Obama would go all in, go there, and do what he needs to do to draw the line, not between him, but draw the line between America's political and constitutional norms, and just how demented and twisted some of the statements and policies this president has promoted over the past year and a half have actually been. Somebody's got to do it, because the Democratic Party does not have a voice of opposition. Barack Obama is that voice
And
right
it was
now.
really, if you could argue, he was campaigning for decency and belief in the system, quite frankly. One of Obama's comments from his speech in Illinois on Friday appears to have gotten under President Trump's skin. During that speech, Mr. Obama reminded the crowd that the economic success Mr. Trump likes to claim credit for actually began under his watch.
By the time I left office, household income was near its all-time high, and the uninsured rate had hit an all-time low, and wages were rising, and poverty rates were falling. I mention all this just so when you hear how great the economy is doing right now, let's just remember when this recovery started.
All right, following that comment, President Trump fired off a number of tweets on the economy over the weekend, including one citing comments from former House Oversight Chairman Jason Chaffetz, quoting, "Barack Obama talked a lot about hope, but Donald Trump delivered the American dream. All the economic indicators, what's happening overseas, Donald Trump has proven to be far more successful than Barack Obama. President Trump is delivering the American dream." Wow, that's delivering a lot of you-know-what. But looking at just one of the most closely watched economic indicators, job creation, it appears President Obama does have the advantage over President Trump. So far this year, an average of 206,000 jobs have been added per month under Trump, an uptick from last year's average of 182,000. But during President Obama's second term, he added an average of 195, 226, and 250,000 jobs per month in his final 3 years. Just adding some facts into the conversation,
Well, but,
Joe.
you know, Mark McKinnon, that's the thing. Barack Obama never could go out and brag about how well the economy was doing under him. He seemed tortured to go out and tell people actually the good news about his administration. He may start doing that now, but there are a lot of Americans, and it's frustrating. There are even a lot of people in news that listen to Donald Trump and see the showmanship and go, well, yeah, the economy has gotten a lot better under him. No, if you just look at hard, fast economic numbers, the rate of growth, the rate of, you know, whether you look at the S&P or whatever, it's about the same under Donald Trump as it was under Barack Obama, who actually inherited the worst economy since 1932.
Well, Joe, I think it's interesting that, you know, first of all, we should compare apples to apples, and let's wait till we have 4 years or 8 years to compare against each other. But you know, we are throwing out all the rules of the campaign, and it's interesting to watch Barack Obama step up, and you can tell he's relishing it. And what's interesting to see is the whole fall, I think, is going to be like this, where we're going to have a split screen with Barack Obama and Donald Trump. And, you know, one is really good at campaigning about hope. The other is really good about campaigning against fear or with fear. So we're going to have a hope-fear element in this campaign, and two of the best at doing hope and doing fear. So it'll be interesting to see.
Well, you know, Nick Confessori, though, also, this isn't a nationwide contest, as you know, and as our viewers know. We're going district by district. You know, Barack Obama is going to pick those California districts and Illinois districts. He's going to pick other districts across America where Republicans are holding the seats, but they were won by Hillary Clinton and sort of have a blue tint to them. It seems to me that Barack Obama is overwhelmingly popular in all of those districts.
Well, look, Joe, his job is not to come out and be the standard bearer for the entire party. He is a targeted shot in the arm in key districts, places where Democrats can flip a seat or get higher turnout and secure a seat. But it's still fascinating to watch him in action. It's like having been in a hall of mirrors with President Trump for the last 2 years, and someone kind of opens the door at the end of the hallway and you see daylight. It's a return to kind of a reality-based politics, and certainly a different tone that you hear from him. He is the polar opposite of President Trump in every way. But the question for me is, this country rejected the politics of President Obama to some extent in 2016 and turned its back on what he was offering. And the huge question for me in 2018 is if that still continues, or if there is some part of the electorate that wants to turn their back on President Trump now.
Hey, you know, Eddie, though, what's so fascinating watching Barack Obama go out there, I see a politician who I disagreed with on many policies, from the way he did his stimulus package to how he didn't move, I thought, as decisively as he needed to in Syria. And I could go down a long list of areas where I disagreed with him ideologically, but I know a lot of Republicans, a lot of conservatives who saw him up there and said, man, it's nice to have a normal guy out there again. Even if I disagree with him, at least we agree on the Constitution, and we agree on, how we treat our neighbors, and we agree on just the basics of American life and the basics in civil discourse on the campaign trail.
Absolutely, Joe. And, as you know, I disagreed with President Obama from ideologically from the left. But it was nice to see and hear reasoned thinking, a kind of thoughtfulness, and in some ways a commitment to the basic norms of democratic life that have in some ways defined the country, at least since I've been born and politically aware. I think what's interesting, though, is that when we think about President Obama stepping out, I think Nick is absolutely right. It's a very deliberate deployment. But he opens up space. Donald Trump has taken up so much of the oxygen in the political room that when Barack Obama stepped on the scene, suddenly we had space to think about matters differently. And I think that was a good in and of itself.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.